Shut up and sit down.
Be excellent to each other and party on, dudes! I am Simon from Nerd Safari, and we're going to take a trip back to 1989 to talk about one of my favorite movies of all time, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
If you guys are really us, what number are we thinking of? 69, dudes!
Bill and Ted's
Excellent! Excellent!
Excellent Adventure.
Now, I was 14 years old when this movie released, and my friend Fraser and I were obsessed with it. We dressed like Bill and Ted, we talked like Bill and Ted, which was kind of unique in rural England in the 1980s, and we even created our own Bill and Ted hand-drawn fan fiction comics. We tried to get in similar adventures and hijinks to Bill and Ted, but of course all we ended up doing was getting in a lot of trouble and pretty much universally making enemies of every parent, security guard, motorist. You know what I'm saying, right? But not everyone enjoyed this movie as much as Fraser and myself. Some people said that it was glorifying idiocy and dumbness. Some people said that the jokes were too lowbrow and just didn't land. And probably, as in most cases, those points of view are somewhat correct, but they're really missing the point of this movie.
But it starts with Bill
I'm Bill S. Preston!
Who was Joan of Arc?
and Ted.
Noah's wife? We're in danger of flunking most heinously tomorrow.
Now, this movie was never supposed to be taken seriously. It's a movie about two high school losers failing history who travel back in time, go on an adventure, rescue some princesses, and not only save their history grades, but as we may find out in a sequel, maybe even save the world.
They're traveling through time.
How's it going, Royal Ugly Dudes?
Put them in the Iron Maiden.
Excellent!
Execute them.
Bogus.
And sure, this movie is definitely silly and goofy, but it's silly and goofy in a charming, endearing way, and you could probably say it's one of the best silly, goofy comedies of that decade.
A force from the future.
Can we go anywhere we want at any time?
You can do anything you want.
And a lot of why we love this movie is down to the chemistry between the two leads, Keanu Reeves and Alex Winter, and between them and their future mentor, played by the incredible comedy legend George Carlin.
No way! Yes way!
It's also worth noting that in a lot of the high school movies we were getting at that time, the actors were in their late 20s, sometimes even in their early 30s, which really took away from the realism. When this movie was made, Alex Winter was 21 and Keanu Reeves had just turned 22, and therefore it was a lot more believable as they were so much closer to that high school age. And let's not forget the supporting cast. You've got amazing characters like Napoleon, Socrates, Beethoven, Joan of Arc, Billy the Kid. Just wall-to-wall awesomeness in the supporting cast.
Sigmund Freud.
Tell me about your mother.
You a musician?
Beethoven.
And last but definitely not least, you've got an incredible soundtrack. 3 years later, I played this album to death on cassette in my first ever car, and to me, the standout song of the album was Extreme's Play With Me, which you probably recognize from the scene where everything starts to unravel in the middle of the San Dimas Mall. Now, Stephen Herrick, the producer who had just come off of great success with the movie Critters, said that he auditioned anywhere from 200 to 300 people for the roles of Bill and Ted. Keanu Reeves was one of the first people he auditioned, ironically, for the role of Bill, but Stephen Herrick actually thought that Keanu Reeves had this kind of lovable goofiness that he really wanted in Ted. The moment he met him, he looked at him and said, "That's my Ted." Now it was a case of finding Bill. So they brought back in about 25 of the most hopeful people that had auditioned for the roles, and Keanu Reeves ended up hanging out with Alex Winter backstage, and they got chatting about the fact that they both come from similar backgrounds, they both enjoy playing bass guitar, and they just really gelled, and because of that rapport between the two of them, Alex Winter was chosen to play Bill S. Preston. Now we have to talk about the phone booth because that sounds like a nightmare. It was a literal phone booth that they duct taped to a hydraulic lift and had in front of a green screen. And as Alex Winter described it as a rickety piece of crap, they had 9 or 10 people in full costume crammed in there with various states of body odor, sometimes for hours at a time, as it's wobbling all over the place. The staff hated it and they started referring to it as the death box. Alex Winter actually described it as being like a death ride canoe from the worst carny ride you've ever been on. But Nintendo Power Magazine ironically actually gave away the Death Box as a contest prize related to Bill and Ted's excellent video game adventure in 1991. So somebody still has that Death Ride canoe in their home. So talking of merchandising, there was a ton. You had a novelization, video games, playing cards, even a Bill and Ted breakfast cereal. And Alex Winter described the breakfast cereal as being the most tragic item on that list because it was made by Purina, who actually make dog food. Not that appetizing. When Napoleon finishes his presentation about the water slide, and Ted says to him, "Dude, I don't think this is gonna work," he's actually correct. The diagram that Napoleon's drawing was actually Napoleon Bonaparte's plan to invade Russia, which led to one of Napoleon's largest defeats in history. Maybe he should have listened to Ted after all. There's also a line in the movie just before they go time traveling when Bill says, "Let's reach out and touch someone."
Let's reach out and touch someone.
And you may be puzzled as to why that is. Back in those days, a lot of people actually still used super old school rotary dial telephones to make phone calls. And Bell System Phone Company were actually trying to promote the use of touch phones. That was their slogan that they used to advertise those touch phones. And they actually saw an increase of sales in touch phones after this movie launched. Now, believe it or not, years before the movie, the characters Bill and Ted with a third person called Bob actually began life as a stand-up comedy group. They would go on stage and talk about current events without having a clue what they were talking about. The comedian who played the third character, Bob, quickly lost interest after just a few shows, making it the Bill and Ted Show, not the Bill, Ted and Bob Show. This movie was originally financed by the De Laurentiis Entertainment Company. However, just after principal photography finished in 1997, the De Laurentiis Entertainment Company went completely bankrupt, and they were trying to find ways to still bring this movie to markets. They were even considering just dumping it onto cable TV. However, fortunately, Nelson Entertainment stepped in 2 years later and salvaged this movie and brought it to the finish line. The script for this movie went through many iterations as well, and one of those iterations saw Bill and Ted going back in time and bumblingly, inadvertently causing all of history's greatest catastrophes, including things like the Hindenburg crash and the sinking of the Titanic. I'm pretty glad they scrapped that idea. The casting for the character of Rufus also was really challenging because they were looking for someone from a rock background. So they were auditioning people like Eddie Van Halen himself, Ringo Starr, Roger Daltrey, even actors like Sean Connery and Charlie Sheen. Thankfully, at the 11th hour, producers Scott Krupp and Bob Court had actually worked with George Carlin before on Outrageous Fortune and came to the producer with the suggestion of Carlin. And the producer immediately fell in love with the idea. Carlin was an established comedy legend at the time, and they said, hell yes. Even with the casting finally in place, the original movie was 2.5 hours long, and initial test audiences described it as plodding. The movie was supposed to open with a giant long dance number that was actually filmed in Stevie Nicks' home in Phoenix, Arizona. Bill and Ted start off the movie aggressively air guitaring at a bus stop. The school bus pulls up and they get on, and a bunch of kids start making fun of them, and it descends into a crazy long dance number. Every shred of that was removed from the final cut of the movie. However, there are still photographic stills that were used in promotional materials of Bill and Ted aggressively air guitaring at that bus stop. The original ending of this movie was also not only very different, but it sounds like very bad, and test audiences didn't like it at all. It starts off with Bill and Ted sat on a grey, boring history teacher's desk, giving a boring history presentation to a class of about 9 people in a boring, ugly suburban town. Then they rush off to a disco with their princesses for the school prom, and they're actually wearing tuxedos and board shorts underneath. And apparently even when filming that original ending, the cast all knew that it was going to be a dud and were already bouncing around ideas for the ending that we know and love today.
Genghis Khan!
But either way, we got the movie we did, and we ended up with one of the best feel-good comedic successes of the 1980s. And do we need a third Bill and Ted movie? Probably not. Can they take my money all day long when it releases? Hell yes. With that, I am Simon from Nerd Safari, and remember, be excellent to each other, and
Party on, dude!
Shut up and sit down.